Now attached you find this project here. It's an Angular project which I opened here, a very simple project where we have a form, a template-driven form, where we can enter a title, content, and then send that post here, like a very simple post in a simple block, to store it on Firebase. And later we also want to add logic to fetch all posts that we stored on Firebase and to clear all posts there. But for now, let's go with creating a new post. And for that, if we have a look at our code, you only have the app component, and there in the app component TS file, you have onCreatePost, which will actually get some post data in this format. Now, let's first of all log that to validate that this is correct and that this works. For that, I opened the developer tools here, and now let's write a new post with some content and click Send Post. And we see that here. So this seems to work. That's perfect. Now, of course, we could reset that form here too if we wanted to, but I'm fine like this. The goal now, of course, is to not just log that here, but to instead send an HTTP request. And for that, we need Angular's help. To be precise, we need to unlock a new feature, so to say. In the app module, we have to add a new core Angular module, or a new module baked into the Angular framework, I should say, which is the HTTP client module. For that, you simply import HTTP client module here from @Angular common/HTTP. So that package name is @Angular/common/HTTP, and you import the HTTP client module. Now you add that HTTP client module here in your imports array. Just like that. This now unlocks the HTTP client Angular offers in your whole project. And with that, we can now start sending requests in our app component here. In there, we now just need to inject our HTTP client, and I'll store it in a property which I just named HTTP. And it's the HTTP client which you need to import from @Angular/common/HTTP. So make sure to add this import at the top of your path. Now with it imported, we can use it to send HTTP requests. And how does this work now? Now let's say here in onCreatePost, once we got that post data, we want to send it to Firebase. For this, we can use that injected HTTP service, and there you have a couple of methods. These methods are mostly named like the HTTP verbs. So you have get, you have delete, you have post, and that will allow you to send different kinds of requests. Now here, since I want to store data, I'll start with a post request. Now you call this method and it takes a couple of arguments. The first argument is the URL you want to send this request to, and that is the URL you can find in your Firebase real-time database, this URL. Or at least this URL is a part of the URL we'll send the request to. So paste that in here, but this is not the entire URL. Now, on a custom or on different REST APIs you're communicating with, you would have clearly defined endpoints, like /posts, add, or something like this, to which you have to send your requests, and the official docs of the API you're working with would tell you which API endpoint to send the request to. For Firebase, it's a bit differently. You have this starting point URL here, and then you can add your own segments after that, and this will get replicated as folders in this database, so to say. And this looks like you're directly talking to the database, but keep in mind that Firebase only abstracts this away from you. You are still communicating with a REST API provided by Firebase. They just translate your path you're sending it to a folder structure in your database. You're not communicating directly with the database here. And I'm stressing this because it is important to keep in mind that you never communicate directly with a database from inside your Angular app. So let's say here, we want to have a node, a folder, so to say, named posts. Well, then we would simply add posts as a segment here. And important for Firebase, you need to add .json. This simply is a Firebase requirement. It's not an Angular requirement, not a REST API requirement, only a requirement by that Firebase REST API. This now allows us to send a post request to that URL. Now, since it's a post request, it doesn't work just like this, however. A post request also needs a request body. Now, this post method here works such that it takes more than one argument. It has at least two required arguments. The second argument being the request body. So we pass one additional argument here, and that could be our post data. So the data we want to store, this data. Now, very important, you normally send JSON data when interacting with a RESTful API. And actually that will happen here as well, but the Angular HTTP client will take our JavaScript object here and automatically convert it to JSON data for us. So it will still send JSON data, and we'll see this in a second when we inspect that request in the browser developer tools, but Angular will transform this automatically for us. Now with this, we have a request that should work. It has all the core data it needs, the URL and the request body. And for now, we don't need to set any other data. Now let's save this and let's give it a try, shall we? So let's go back to our application, enter some content here, and click Send Post. Did something happen? Let's check Firebase. Well, I don't see any data here, and we would see it here. Let's check the Network tab. So in the browser developer tools and the Chrome developer tools, go to the Network tab here. You see a bunch of network requests actually. These are all the files that are downloaded as part of your Angular application, and all the JavaScript files and so on. Let's clear that. Let's simply send another post, and we don't see any request here. So somehow this request is not being sent. And that happens on purpose. Angular heavily uses observables, as you already learned. And HTTP requests are also managed via observables because they are a perfect scenario or use case for observables. We can wrap them and we can then subscribe to them to get informed about the response and to handle errors and so on. The thing just is, Angular is smart, so to say. If you're not subscribing to that prepared HTTP request, you could say, so to that observable that wraps your HTTP request, if you're not subscribing to it, then Angular and RxJS know that no one's interested in the response, and therefore the request doesn't even get sent, because if no one's interested in the response, then it won't send the request. So post indeed will return an observable, as you can also see here. It does not give us the response or anything like that as a return value. It gives us an observable that wraps your request. And to get access to the response, you have to call subscribe here. And this will then be your response data actually. Because Angular, the HTTP client I should say, will do even more than just giving you the response. It will automatically extract the data attached to the response, so the response body, and give you that. Though you also have ways of accessing the full response, as you'll learn later. So for now, let's simply console log that response data to get a feeling for whether that works and what we get here. So let's save this. And now with the subscription set up and with us subscribing here, by the way, you don't need to manage the subscription and unsubscribe because it will complete after being done anyways, and it's an observable provided by Angular for which you never need to manage subscriptions. But that's just a side note. So now let's simply test this. Here, let me clear all network requests again. Well, actually, let's first of all open the console again. And let's now try this again. Send a post. And now we get a log here, which looks good. Let's ignore what's in there for now. It's a JavaScript object. We can see that, but it has a name and then some cryptic key here. Let's have a look at the Network tab. And there we also see that request now. We actually see two requests even. Two requests to the posts endpoint. Now, that's just a characteristic of browsers. When sending post requests, so not to /posts, but of type post, then they always send two requests. The first one, if you click on that, is of type options. That's a different HTTP verb that will, first of all, check whether the post request is allowed to be sent. And if that gets a success response, it will send the actual request, which is this one. And there you see that was of type post. This was the URL it sent it to. It succeeded. These are the response headers we got back by Firebase. And these are the request headers we sent. And for example, this one and the content type headers were added automatically to the request sent for you by Angular. You didn't add these headers, they were added by Angular. And here in the request payload, you also see that JSON data that was attached for you. You can also, of course, see the response here, which is the response we logged to the console. So this is how we send HTTP requests, and besides the general syntax, the core takeaway is that requests are only sent when you subscribe. So requests are sent with the post method, and we do only send them when we subscribe. Let's ignore the data we get back here for now, and let's now add another request that actually gets us all the posts. And for this, I'll add a new private property in here, which I'll name fetch posts. And in here, I want to again use the HTTP client and now the get method and send a get request to that same URL we used for storing the data, because that is the URL from which we'll be able to get that data. Now, before we actually go further, let's have a quick look at Firebase. And there you should now also see that posts node here. And in there you have that cryptic key again, which is an automatically generated ID by Firebase, by the way. That's a convenience feature by Firebase. It generates such IDs for you. But if you expand this too, you see your data. So now the goal is to fetch that data. We want to fetch all the posts that were created. Therefore, we're preparing this GET request. And now, since this is a GET request, this also needs no second argument, because GET requests have no request body, because, well, you're not sending any data. You're instead just requesting data. One thing you need to do here too, however, is you need to subscribe. No subscription, no request. So you need to subscribe here, and we should get back our posts here. That's the hope. So we get back our posts here, and we can then console log posts to get an idea of what we're actually getting back. Now I put this into that fetch posts method because we can now call this from two different places. From in on fetch posts here, where I now just call this fetch posts. But I also want to call this from inside ng on init. So whenever this page loads, whenever this app loads, I want to fetch posts. And this should therefore call this method and send this request. Let's save this, and this will reload the page and should now already send such a request. And indeed, here is some data we get back. And it looks like we're getting back a JavaScript object, which has one key value pair in our case, where the key is this cryptic key, this cryptic string. And the value of that is the original object we stored. So it's a nested object here. That is the data we originally sent to the back. And this is the data we are getting back. Now, that of course means that if I want to store all my posts in an array here, through which we then can loop to output that, we would need to transform this object here, because it's a JavaScript object, to an array, and we need to transform that data. Well, that screams for observable operators.